Hey everyone. These are the prefaces from Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1930 to 1941, part one, the dominated. Um, which is part of just my general research on the Russian question. I probably actually should read the first part, just the contents of the book as well. So here we go. Preface to the French edition, preface to the English edition of the third volume, first part of Class Struggles in the USSR, key to abbreviations and Russian words used in the text, key to abbreviations used in bibliographical notes, quote, directions for use. Part 1, the peasantry expropriated. Chapter 1, quote, the socialist transformation of agriculture, end quote, and the class struggles. 2, quote, socialist agriculture in the 1930s. 3, the kolkhoz system. Part 2, the militarized working class. 1, the urbanization process. 2, extension of the wage-earning class and the rigidifying of factory despotism. Part 3, mass terror and forced labor. 1, mass repression and terror. 2, the combination of mass repression and terror. Part 4, capital and its crises. 1, accumulation in 1928 to 1940. 2, the first 5-year plans. 3, the economic crisis of the 1930s. 4, crises of overaccumulation and domination of capital. Conclusion, a capitalism of a new type. Alright, so that's the table of contents, and now we can start reading the prefaces. Preface to the French edition. Stalinism was one systematic whole. Analysis of the class struggles in the USSR during the 1930s confronts a situation which was particularly complicated and rapidly changing. It is required an order of research which cannot be reproduced in the order of exposition. The results of our analysis of Stalinism and its realities will therefore be presented in 2 volumes. The first volume is devoted to the dominated, peasants, workers, the repression and mass terror which struck them, capital accumulation and its particular crises which made them its victims. The second volume deals with the dominators, their ideology and its changes in the 1930s, the manifestations of the new class and the historical conditions of its formation, the role of the party and of the USSR's foreign policy. This order of exposition will enhance clarity, but at the same time will not prevent certain repetitions necessary for an understanding of the step-by-step evolution of the different elements and factors which make up, from top to bottom, Stalinism. The reader is asked to tolerate a little inconsistency in this regard. Charles Bettelheim. Preface to the English edition of the third volume, first part of Class Struggles in the USSR. The appearance in English of the third volume of Class Struggles in the USSR comes 10 years after its publication in French, 10 years of economics, political, and social upheavals of exceptional importance. These upheavals have directly touched those countries who claimed allegiance to socialism and have produced enduring effects on the international scene, one of which lies in viewing the current transition as a testimony of the, quote, failure of socialism. New section. On the alleged, quote, failure of socialism, the present work stands opposed to this thesis since it reveals that the USSR and other countries who had declared that they had, quote, built socialism had not actually accomplished any of the radical social transformations which could have permitted them to break away from this specific form of state capitalism, which I have described as, quote, party capitalism. In fact, it is the latter which has failed. The failure was brought about in the USSR through the aggravation of a general crisis born from the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production and particular forms reclothed by these contradictions under conditions of party capitalism. All the so-called socialist countries have entered into a similar process. These have developed according to the specific modalities determined by their own history. These countries had a number of similar characteristics. They were all, for example, subject to the leadership of a single party which upheld its legitimacy from Marx's works. Among other objectives, this book seeks to throw light on the usurped character of this, quote, legitimacy. Against this background, it seems to me useful to present some other remarks. New section, on Marx's work. The analyses presented here bear upon the scientific content of the work inaugurated by Marx. This work is very much alive, open to newer fields of inquiry, and therefore capable of being enriched through rectifications and criticisms inspired by experience and social practices. Indeed, it is precisely this capacity which has allowed it to remain current and relevant. These two qualities have been confirmed by the movement of contemporary history, by the unfolding of the crisis of international capitalism, which entails a deepening of social and economic polarization, increase in unemployment and underemployment, rise in criminality, corruption, and the use of drugs, escalation of armed conflicts, etc., on the one hand, while on the other hand these qualities are confirmed by the ability of Marx's works to take into account the contradictions of several allegedly socialist models and their consequences. The scientific character of most of Marx's work concerns above everything else Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production, the capitalist mode of production structures and contradictions, and illuminating the laws governing the capitalist mode of production's movement. Marx showed how the working of these laws led to a growing domination of the market order, the extension of the domination of capital and capital's globalization, accumulation of riches at one end of the quote, society, now extending to the entire planet, and poverty at the other end. Social struggles led victoriously by the exploited are the only means by which the working of these laws can be breached, and the social relations upon which they are founded to be smashed. That Marx's scientific work was able to anticipate the subsequent transformations of capitalism and its major consequences must not lead in a paradoxical manner to the illusion that, contrary to other sciences, Marx's scientific work will be infallible and capable of formulating, quote, eternal truths, touching upon a future that is situated beyond the scope of all social practice. Marx had on many occasions guarded against those who believed that they could predict the future. He had recalled that, quote, men make their own history, end quote, and that the outcome of these struggles is not, quote, guaranteed, so long as these have not been overcome. Also, even if his writings are far from being exempt of prophetic declarations, the range and scope of which are well worth exploring, Marx had himself rightly criticized those who sought, according to his expression, quote, to boil the pots of the future, end quote, and predesign the concrete forms of the transition to a, quote, classless society, end quote. See Critique of the Gotha Program. Marx knew that history had more imagination than us, and that its, quote, irony could be bitter. Today, while the movement for the abolition of the existing order is going through an exceptional crisis, it is important as never before for those who claim to be fidel to Marx's work to show proof of their initiative and not condemn it to paralysis. For this purpose, they must, in order to enrich it, treat this work, as is the case with all sciences, in a manner that does not hesitate to question its conclusions and its fundamentals when this is necessary, since the only way of keeping a science alive is to take into account that which real history and practice never fail to teach us. It is all the more necessary to bear these considerations in mind, since ignoring these considerations or occulting these considerations has served to maintain the established, quote, order, and has allowed adherents of the latter to speak of the, quote, failure of Marxism. In this context, it is necessary to present a few other reflections by way of supporting what has been outlined above. New section. On the alleged, quote, failure of Marxism, end quote. The possible points of departure of the reflections that follow are several. I've chosen to begin by questioning Bukharin's affirmation according to which Marx's work constituted a, quote, block of steel. It seems to me that this point of departure is justified since this affirmation had implicitly sustained, quote, Soviet Marxism, to which it served as a, quote, title of legitimacy, and can foster several other forms of dogmatism. Now a serious examination of Marx's work reveals that this is indeed questionable. Comparing Marx's work to a, quote, block of steel is to already betray Marx's work through a denial of its historical insertion, its continuous development, and its essential characteristics. Accepting this comparison provides the possibility of arbitrarily choosing any, quote, quotation taken from a complex work to unduly, quote, justify so-called, quote, Marxist analyses and conclusions, but which are actually deprived of any sound basis. Marx was highly conscious of the risk of distortion, especially since this distortion often occurred under his own eyes. He had denounced what he called, quote, self-styled Marxism, declaring to Lafargue, quote, what is clear is that I myself am not a Marxist, end quote. Bracket, letter from Engels to Bernstein dated November 3rd, 1882, end bracket. Since these words were delivered, history has largely confirmed its bearer. It has shown that it is indispensable to recognize that Marx's work is rich, multiple, and tirelessly creative, that, like all living reality, it includes contradictory aspects, and to arbitrarily abstract one of these at the expense of ignoring the content is tantamount to not respecting the integral nature of Marx's work. It may also be recalled that concrete historical developments and social struggles gave birth not to one, but several Marxisms. Those who declared themselves the most, quote, orthodox were the most dogmatic. The worst deviations from the struggle for social emancipation were committed in their name. These Marxisms provided the weapons to fight the exploited and oppressed by calling upon them to respect an order which was none other than the established order, even though it had been, quote, smeared in red, end quote, as Lenin said of the Soviet state apparatus in 1921. We cannot therefore speak of a failure of Marxism, since Marxism does not exist. What exists are several Marxisms which derive their origins from social struggles and from different aspects of Marx's work. Such a proposition might appear discouraging. In my view, however, it is not, since it calls for the development of the only kind of Marxism that is defensible, critical Marxism. New section. For a critical Marxism. Quote, critical Marxism is the rational kernel of Marx's work and also the works of those who remain, quote, fidel to him. This does not, however, consist in simply repeating what Marx said, but in retaining that which is in fact essential to forge ahead. Remaining fidel to Marx's work is, in this sense, has several important implications. Above all, it involves not looking for answers in his work which either do not exist or which are not at any rate to be found there. Marx was, as anybody else, to borrow an expression from Hegel, a, quote, child of his time, end quote. Respecting this requirement is the only way of rendering Marx's work forever current and powerful by enriching it through lessons, made possible by and which cannot be bypassed from practice and history. This then implies a need to continuously extend the movement of Marx's work. This movement that enabled Marx to develop a radical critique of the existing order, the crimes of which Marx not only denounced, but also showed that they could only get worse, something which the experience of the past century tragically illustrates. It also implies the task of continuing the criticism of ideological forms under which this, quote, order comes to be viewed as, quote, eternal and the, quote, best possible. Further, it implies being alert to the new, i.e., innovation and change, in order to extract lessons and rectify what the old might have wrongly suggested. The emergence of newer social transformations is a result of developments in scientific thought, in class struggles and popular initiatives to which Marx attached considerable importance when he declared, quote, the emancipation of the working class cannot but be the act of the workers themselves, end quote. This already condemned any kind of diktat derived from a text or imposed by a party which wished to view itself as the, quote, guide of the revolution, end quote. Finally, it implies an effort to keep, quote, alive the capacity of Marxist thought to criticize itself and to treat criticism as something that is welcome. A critical Marxism of this kind stands opposed to all proclaimed, quote, orthodoxies, which can only be conservative and consequently serve the existing order. Rejecting all assimilation into a, quote, system, it firmly rejects the concept of monolithism by remaining open to the practice of free debate that is indispensable to the conquest of democracy. The failure of pseudo-socialisms and dogmatic Marxisms that were linked to them heralds the beginning of a period during which the revolutionary character of critical Marxism can clearly develop and manifest itself. Among the scientific tasks that need to be urgently addressed include a balance sheet of pseudo-socialisms and their ideologies, an exercise in critical reflection having a bearing upon the different Marxisms in a manner that retains their positive lessons and rejects the rest, analysis of the forms of domination of capitalist apparatuses and the modalities of their transformation into private capitalists and the new forms assumed by the class struggle. While the domination of capital considered globally is tending toward greater concentration to an extent that has no precedence hitherto. The present work, which attempts to show that, quote, what, quote, socialism and Soviet, quote, Marxism had been, can perhaps be considered as the beginning of a necessary renewal of critical and revolutionary Marxism. Charles Bettelheim, Paris, June 1993. Excuse me, it says translated by Ramnath Narayan Swami. It looks like Ramnath Narayanaswamy uh, is a professor of social sciences at Flame University. Anyway. Let's see if there's anything else to read. There's some abbreviations here. Key to abbreviations in Russian words used in the text: Artel, traditional form of cooperative; CC, Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks; Sharaga, research establishment of NKVD, staffed by detainees; Communist Party Soviet CPSU-B, Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks; Gosplan, State Planning Commission; GPU, State Political Administration, Security Services; Gulag, Labor Camp Administration; Kaz Rashyat, Application of Proper Accounting Procedures; Kolkaz Center, Central Organization for managing the USSR's collective farms; Kolkhoz, collective farm; Kolkhoznik, collective farm peasant; Contractatia, delivery contract system between state collecting organizations and peasants or kolkhozes; Krai, region; Mir, traditional peasant commune; MTS, machine and tractor station; NEP, New Economic Policy; NKVD, Commissariat of the Interior; OGPU, successor organization of GPU until its security functions taken over by NKVD; Orgnabor, organized recruitment; Otruda, local organization of labor commissariat; Rayon, district; RKK, commission for settling labor disputes; Seredniak, middle (average) peasant; Skod, traditional peasant assembly; Sovkhoz, state farm; Sovnarkom, council of people's commissars; Traktor center, central organization for distributing and managing the tractor stock; Trododen, accounting unit used on collective farms for calculating payments to peasants, literally, quote, Labor Day, end quote; plural, Trudodny; VSNKH, Supreme Economic Council; ZEK, detainee, from Russian abbreviation ZK for prisoner, plural, Zeki. And then there's a section called Directions for Use. Volumes 3 and 4 of Class Struggle in the USSR constitutes the provisional terminus of a route for which Volumes 1 and 2 were important stages. This route, which here I shall not discuss from a personal aspect, led me to results and re-evaluations which raised questions about some of the suggestions put forward in the first 2 volumes of this study. Now, I don't know myself, but I know Charles Bettelheim was an influence on Paresh Chattopadhyay, who's definitely like a libertarian. I would say he's something comparable to a council communist. Definitely dedicated his books to Maximilien Rubel, and to the Kronstadt rebels, and Rosa Luxemburg. So I'm not sure. I've heard this thing, and now I don't know a lot about Charles Bettelheim, but I have heard that he moved into a more libertarian direction out of Stalinism, and then I think he was, a pro-China guy in the Sino-Soviet split, and then moved in a more libertarian direction. Now, I'm not sure about I've heard that. I don't know what is true. So let's see what what comes next. This route, which here I shall not discuss from a personal aspect, led me to results and reevaluations which raised questions about some of the suggestions put forward in the first two volumes of this study. In particular, I have felt it necessary to modify my earlier characterization of the October Revolution and its aftermath. The present text is largely devoted to this new characterization. Before embarking on new formulations, I should add that these are not the result simply of, quote, research, devoted in this case to Russia, and of a secluded contemplation. They have been impressed upon me not only by analysis of what has happened in the USSR, but also by many recent events, especially those involving China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Poland. These events exemplify the attraction exerted by a process of transformation, one which tends to gradually break with the demands of a totalitarian system in which a single party claims the right to manage state and society and to reserve freedom of speech to itself alone. Moreover, perusal of books recently published about the Russian Revolution and a return to the analysis of Soviet history in the 1930s have made clearer the gap separating the speeches and promises of October from revolutionary and post-revolutionary reality. One second, there's footnotes here, and I don't know where these footnotes lead. Okay. Footnote 1. Among recent works, I would particularly mention four important studies by Mark Farrow, The Russian Revolution of February 1917, October 1917, Des Soviets au Communisme Bureaucratique, published in 1980, also by Mark Farrow. Let's see. See if there's anything on French Wikipedia for Mark Farrow. Okay, let me finish reading the footnote first. I would also recommend Martin Malia's Comprendre les Révolutions Russes. I think Martin Malia is kind of a conservative guy. I'm not sure. Aline Carrière de In Chaos, Le Pouvoir Confisqué. On a different plane, an important book by Bernard Chavance should be mentioned. Le Capital Socialiste, 1980, as well as Claude Lafour's L'Invention Démocratique. That's actually very interesting because Claude Lafleur, if you followed the Russian question at all, and you've followed this channel at all, was an important member of CEMI, which kind of was kind of a vanguard in France, at least, of putting forward the notion of the USSR as some kind of a totalitarian bureaucratic capitalism. I don't think they use the word state capitalism. So that's interesting. And especially because considering that Société CEMI Barbarie was very critical of Bettelheim, because Bettelheim was kind of viewed as like probably one of the more articulate apologists for the Soviet Union in like the 50s and so on. Like I said, he was like a Maoist. But I'm not sure where he ended up, but we'll see. I'm going to look up some of these people. So, Mark Farrow lived from 1924 to 2021. Was a French teacher, researcher, and historian. Again, this is Google translating from French. Director of Studies at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences. He is a specialist in Russia, the USSR, and the history of cinema. Let's skip some of this stuff about his biography. Study of the Russian Revolution. At the same time as his professorship, Marc Ferrer worked on his thesis. The contemporary historian Pierre Runevin suggested that he devote it to the Russian Revolution of 1917. Thus, Ferrer specialized in the early 1960s in Soviet history, a field which he tried to convey a non-ideological discourse and to show through audiovisual and written archives that the proletarian revolution was made not by the working class but by women, soldiers, and peasants. His studies in the field of social history contrast with the then dominant analyses of the, quote, school of totalitarianism. According to him, the October uprising cannot be reduced to the Bolshevik coup d'etat because it is inseparable from the ongoing revolutionary or popular movement. Marc Ferrer also analyzes the process of bureaucratization, absolutization of power from the top, but also from the base. He nevertheless contests in two works and an article the massacre of the Russian imperial family in Yekaterinburg in July 1918. According to Ferrer's analyses and the examination of unpublished archives, only the Russian Tsar Nicholas II was shot when his family of Germanic descent was spared and transferred to Perm for an exchange with Germany. That's interesting. I've never heard that at all. Ferrer claims to be a non-communist leftist. In March 2007, during the French presidential campaign, he signed with 150 intellectuals an appeal to vote for the socialist candidate Ségolène Royal, quote, against a right of arrogance, end quote, for, quote, a left of hope, end quote, after having supported in 2002 the candidacy of Jean-Pierre Chevènement. In February 1979, Marc Ferrer was one of 34 signatories of the declaration drafted by Leon Poliakov and Pierre Vidal-Naquet to dismantle the negationist rhetoric of Robert Faurisson. He was later one of the authors of the petition Freedom for History. I don't really know much about this, but just a few comments from myself about this little topic here. Leon Poliakov, I know, has books about left-wing negationism that are published by Farlach, which is a radical left publisher in Germany that has books put out by Caho Brendel about Anton Pannekoek. It has a version of Marx's Capital that it's published. It also has pieces about members of the Frankfurt School. It is Helmut Reichelt. I think Gerhard Backhaus has books with them. They published Roman Rozdolsky's books, and they assembled the work of Alfred Sohn-Rethel. But they're also part of the anti-nationalist, anti-Deutsch movement, and take a pro-Israel stance, or at least pro-Israel in the sense of commitment to Israel's continued existence. Not any particular policy that Israel may or may not choose to hold, but they come from that background. So Leon Poliakov, I don't really know much about, but I think that's very interesting. Also, this negationist rhetoric of Robert Faurisson, I don't know exactly. I think Noam Chomsky wrote a introduction to one of Robert Faurisson's books about freedom of speech or whatever, which is disgusting. But I've heard some people say that he didn't actually write. It was kind of like a declaration of freedom, a thing about freedom of speech that's kind of tacked on to the publication of Robert Faurisson, but I'm not sure if that's true or not. But I think that's very upsetting. That Noam Chomsky would have an introduction to a Holocaust denier's book on defense of speech, free speech grounds. Anyway, Marc Ferrer died on the night of the 21st of April 2021 in Maison Lafitte, quote, taken away by a complication of COVID-19. Okay. Mark Ferrer initiated the reflection on cinema and history. He used cinema as an instrument of knowledge of the history of societies, considering that cinema provides a testimony in the same way as traditional sources. Ferrer presented on television first on September from 1989, Sept from 1989, and then on Arte from 1992, a historical program of viewing archives with a time lag of 50 years called Histoire Parallèle. Its start corresponds to the eve of the Second World War, with the analysis of cinematographic news from the different camps, then of less old archives, to be able to compare the eras. In 1993, Mark Ferrer was co-writer of the film Pétain, I guess like the collaborationist government of the Vichy regime, and the film was co-written with Jean Mabeuf. Yeah, so that's Mark Ferrer. And who did I want to look up else? Bernard Chavance. I think Bernard Chavance is also like secondary literature is part of I don't know if anything. Not really seeing anything for Bernard Chavance. He has books out by Routledge. One's Institutional Economics, and one's titled The Transformation of Communist Systems. Yeah. Most of his stuff is in French, I see. Anyway. So that's that. Claude Lefort, Invention of Democracy. I'm looking up that book if there's anything for... Yeah, he has a whole bunch of books that are in French that I can't get a description of. This one book, Le Capital Socialiste, Bernard Chavance. Come on. I'm trying to translate it in English, but it looks like it says Le Capital Socialiste, Histoire critique de l'économie politique du socialisme, 1917 to 1954. This is I don't know what the hell does that mean. A historical critique or critical history of the political economy of socialism, 1917 and 1954, something of that surely. So it sounds like a very interesting topic of a book, but again, there's nothing for it. Let's see if there's anything for this Lefort book. God damn it. What is this? Sorry, it's like the PDF is like copied. It's like a photocopy, so I can't really like copy and paste, but I still want to look this shit up. Okay, so here we are. Let's see what the French description. This book says. The Democratic Invention, The Limits of Totalitarian Domination by Claude Lafleur. Unlike many intellectuals of his generation, Claude Lafleur can claim a rare consistency in the analysis of communist regimes, which he describes as totalitarian as early as 1956. I think you probably would describe it earlier. For 35 years, Claude Lafleur worked tirelessly to dismantle the political and ideological mechanisms of a system that aimed for complete domination of social life, and no less to detect all the signs of the irreducible gap between the totalitarian project and the reality of the matter. The text published in 1981 state his conviction that the collapse of communism is inevitable. This judgment stems from a political vision of modern societies. For Claude Lafleur, knowledge of communism is inseparable from a reflection on democracy. To those who have put communism on trial based on a theory of how the economy works in industrial societies, he counters that this regime has had civil and political liberties as its primary target, that it derives from a revolution that is much more anti-democratic than anti-capitalist. This sheds light on the current crisis in countries that have emerged from communism. In part, the economic liberalism that accompanied the unleashing of market violence indicates the route of communist ideology, but is it not remarkable that it finds a privileged terrain in societies dismantled by totalitarian domination, where the notion of law, association, and a collective resistance have been erased from the population? More than ever, the question arises, what is democratic invention? It's very interesting. Yes. So it's interesting that he would have these books. I mean, if he thinks these books are worth reading, that kind of suggests that Bettelheim did go into a libertarian direction. Where am I? So, end footnote. Next footnote. Making the effort to measure this gap, one is to take seriously Marx's declaration in the foreword of his critique des Hegelschen Staatsrecht. Quote, one does not evaluate a revolutionary epoch according to that revolutionary epoch's own idea of itself. End quote. Marx. Okay, end footnote. Thank you. Sorry for the awkwardness of that bit, but forgive me. Consideration of this gap and revealing the reason for it was, right from the start, one of the aims of this study. I believe that I am now closer to this objective than I was when I prepared the first volume. I would add that discussions I have had with those kind enough to read parts of the preliminary drafts of volumes 3 and 4 of this study, whether they agreed with me or not, have given me considerable help in evaluating, in a way I might otherwise not have done, the significance and the distinctive features of the October Revolution. Footnote. I have in this way had the benefit of very useful comments by René Sellier, Bernard Chavance, Yves Dureau, Siegfried Grosskopf, K.S. Carroll, Alain Lepitz, Thierry Picot, Rosanna Rosanda, Jacques Sapir, Patrick Tissier, Paulette Van Heck, Eric Veen, Francois Wall, as well as many other too numerous to mention, including the participants in my seminars at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Again, I apologize for any mispronunciation. Some of you see these names like Alain Lepietz. I think some of these people were like from like the regulation school. I don't know if Bernard Chavance was, but he's definitely, some of these names are definitely familiar to me, but most of them are not. End footnote. As is known, the October insurrection interrupted a plural revolutionary process which began in February 1917, and the fall of Tsardom, with the fall of Tsardom and the formation of a provisional government. The first component of this process was a peasant revolutionary movement of exceptional strength, which in the countryside deeply shook the established order. In effect, the peasant revolution led to the sharing out, progressively, of the land of the big landowners. This began before October and continued afterward. The second component was that which inspired the hopes of social emancipation entertained by certain parts of the working class and intelligentsia. These hopes took concrete form in the development of the activity of the Soviets, in the spread of factory committees and the varied growth of their role. They were also manifested in the movement in favor of democratic freedoms, installation of a representative system, and of a state founded on law. The struggle for the convocation of a constituent assembly formed part of this movement. A third component, finally, is that which a certain version of the Marxist, Vulgate sometimes tries to designate as the, democratic and anti-imperialist revolution, and sometimes as the, socialist revolution, but whose historical significance cannot be conveyed by those terms. The latter refer to a certain revolutionary mythology. The socialist revolution, the term socialist revolution, refer to a certain revolutionary mythology, to the conflict between the old, 1789, and the, new, 1917, which is in the process of being born. This third component of the revolutionary process corresponds to the revolt of part of the people and of the Russian intelligentsia, who do not wish to see their country continuing to serve as an instrument for imperialist groups struggling for a new share out of the world, and who also reject the subordinate place of Russia on the world economic and political scene. The leaders of this component declared themselves ready to govern the country through the Soviets, and they allotted an essential role to the states take over the means of production in order to develop rapidly the productive forces. On the political level, the revolutionary process, which began in 1917, in February 1917, was characterized by the multiplication throughout the country of councils or Soviets composed of workers, peasants, soldiers, and of their delegates. Between February and October 1917, the real political power, insofar as it still existed, was, divided in two, end quote. Parenthesis, hence the expression, dual leadership, end quote, used to describe the situation of this time. Usually it's dual power, maybe that's just an English translation, which is the situation, that's just the, the way that it's usually translated in English is dual power. Parenthesis, the expression, dual leadership, used to describe the situation of this time, which is the situation of revolutionary crisis, end parenthesis. These, two powers, end quote, parenthesis, the provisional government on the one hand, and the Soviets on the other, end parenthesis, were extremely weak and their authority much reduced, did not extend throughout the entire country. The February Revolution therefore marked the start of a series of complex transformations which were accompanied by a solid popular mobilization, a relative strengthening of the authority of the Soviets, and the development of the influence of the Bolsheviks over a section of the masses, whose aspirations for an immediate peace and certain urgent demands, parenthesis, like the appropriation of land by the peasants, end parenthesis, they expressed. The description which Lenin gave of the revolutionary crisis which developed after February 1917, parenthesis, when Lenin spoke of the entanglement of, bourgeois democratic and, proletarian revolutions, end parenthesis, is, for the circumstances, inadequate, because it conveys a false representation of a reality which is infinitely more complex, and, in order to maintain myths, it fails to take into consideration the great diversity of the participating movements. Footnote. For these terms, see the first volume of this study. End footnote. Today, I feel this representation has seriously obscured understanding it was radically novel in the revolutionary process that was in full bloom after February 1917, a process, moreover, whose potential development can only be guessed at, since it was brutally cut short by the Bolshevik seizure of power. This seizure of power marks the beginning of the end of the pro-revolutionary process, which was born in February 1917, and whose last spasm would be at Kronstadt in March 1921. Just a side note, I'm not sure about this, so I'd have to reflect, and you should use to just take this with a grain of salt. But I think, in the first volume, and this is why I think this is probably why Bettelheim is talking about, the development of his thought. I think in the first volume, which is not on Libcom, and I'm assuming this might be why, when this volume is on Libcom, is that I think Bettelheim reproduces, some Stalinist myths, or Leninist myths. Actually, Leninist is the more appropriate word, for the content of the Kronstadt uprising, viewing it as kind of like a white plot or something, which I don't even think many Bolsheviks accepted. I don't think Lenin accepted that it was a white plot, or Bukharin accepted it was a white plot, for instance, and that, but that it was objectively counter-revolutionary and thus needed to be put down. Whatever the subjective intentions of the Kronstadt rebels are, that's kind of their thing. But I think Bettelheim in that previous book kind of makes it sound like it was a white plot of some kind, in control of the white plot, in league with the white plot. Anyway, the Soviets were then transformed into ratifying and executive organs for government and Bolshevik party decisions, whilst the participation of the masses was progressively broken in thousands of theaters of activity. Footnote. This description follows that of Claude Lefort in La Question de la Révolution. See Lefort's L'invention démocratique. End footnote. Instead, there was substituted just one such theater, that of the party, soon to be the sole party, which claimed to incarnate the people and to make history. The party presented itself as though it had made the revolution and alone knew how to make the revolution work, and so it soon banned as subversive all discourse apart from its own. Any dissenting opinion was held to be, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote. Parenthesis, quote, whoever is not with us is against us, end quote, as it was said, end parenthesis. October made it possible for a managerial team, benefiting from the sympathy of part of the urban masses, to place itself at the head of an organized movement and of new organs of power in order to try to, quote, guide the country along a predetermined track. In this way, a, quote, revolution from above, end quote, was initiated, in which a decisive role was played by the directing organs of the Bolshevik Party. The banning of other parties like the Socialist Revolutionaries, or Socialist Revolutionaries, SRS, and the Menshevik Party, parenthesis, which included many workers, in parenthesis, and it should be noted top Marxist intellectuals like Isaac Illich Rubin, I believe, was a Menshevik, and as well as Julius Martov, important radical left intellectuals. The subordination of the trade unions to the Bolshevik Party and the way the latter functioned all progressively closed the door to any possibility of organized expression on the part of workers, peasants, or intellectual workers. Thus, the power installed in October 1917 by the Bolsheviks, power which proclaimed itself the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, in reality was a dictatorship in the name of the proletariat, and it was finally exercised over the working class itself. Lenin implicitly recognized this fact on many occasions. Thus in 1919, Lenin declared that the dictatorship of the proletariat in Soviet Russia corresponded to a, quote, government for the working people, end quote, and not a, quote, government by the working people, end quote. Lenin even added that this power was not authentically proletarian. Footnote. On this point, see Volume 1 of this study, page 98, and Lenin's collected works. And this is a kind of thing that, that people who don't aren't coming from the Leninist tradition, so people who are not Trotskyist but radical Marxist critics of the Soviet Union say that, like, even Lenin, while he was alive, was saying that state capitalism is what had been achieved. Like, some of the Lenin's own proclamations of the state of affairs in the Soviet Union were infinite. Some of his comments on the state of affairs in the Soviet Union prior to his death were infinitely more sober than later accounts of the Russian Revolution by people in the Trotskyist milieu. Anyway, although Lenin refrained from drawing such a conclusion, such phrases meant that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, it says a typo. It says proletariat. I was like, is that a word, a special word he's using? But I think it's a typo. Although Lenin refrained from drawing such a conclusion, such phrases meant that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, is only a fiction. The latter represents, in an inverted form, the real relationship, which are those of a dictatorship exercised over the proletariat. Such an inverted presentation of the real relationship has enormous significance. On the one hand, it constituted the founding myth of Soviet Russia, presented as the country of the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and of the, quote, Great October Socialist Revolution, end quote. On the other hand, it signified the subjection of the Bolshevik Party to an alienated ideology, which had the party, whatever its real relationship with the actual proletariat, affirming that it was the, quote, vanguard of the latter. In this way, the Bolshevik Party claimed a, quote, proletarian legitimacy, end quote, which in some way was, quote, consubstantial, end quote. The hell does consubstantial mean? Consubstantial. Consubstantial means of the same substance or essence, parenthesis, used especially of the three persons of the Trinity in Christian theology, end parenthesis. Wikipedia says consubstantiality is a term derived from Latin consubstantialitas, denotes identity of substance or essence in spite of difference in aspect. It appears most commonly in its adjectival form, quote, consubstantial, end quote, from Latin consubstantialis, and its best known use is in regard to an account, in Christian theology, of the relation between Jesus Christ and God the Father. Back to the text. This gave it a dispensation from giving an account of itself to the working class, which was judged, quote, less advanced than itself. Certainly the party had to pay attention to what the workers were thinking, but with the aim of, quote, educating and, quote, guiding them, and if necessary, of punishing those who did not recognize its authority. Thus, quote, working class power, end quote, could be rigorously used against that class. As Lenin told L.O. Frossard, L.O. Frossard is Ludwig Oskar Frossard, lived from 1889 to 1946, also known as L.O. Frossard and Oskar Frossard, was a French socialist and communist politician. Now that I'm reading this, I'm like, was this one of the people that was on, I don't know, I think I have an article on here about Trotsky's train, and I'm wondering if L.O. Frossard was one of the guests that was on Trotsky's train during the Russian Civil War. I'm not sure. Frossard was a founding member in 1905 and Secretary General of the French Socialist Party from 1918 to 1920, as well as a founding member and Secretary General of the French Communist Party, PCF, from 1920 to 1922. On the 1st of January 1923, Froissart resigned his position and left the communist movement over political differences. Froissart briefly attempted to establish an independent communist political organization before returning to the ranks of the SFIO, gaining election to parliament under that party's banner in 1928, 1932, and 1936. From 1935 until 1940, Ludovic Oscar Froissart held a series of ministerial positions in successive governments of Pierre Laval, Albert Sarraut, Camille Chatham, Leon Blum, Edouard Daladier, Paul Renan, and the first government of Philippe Pétain. Following the armistice between France and Nazi Germany, Froissart declined to participate in the Vichy government headed by Pétain, but continued to work as a journalist. His position led to his investigation, trial, and acquittal over accusations of collaborationism following the fall of the Pétain regime. Pétain regime. I don't know how to say that fucking name. But, you get the idea. So, alright, back to the text. So that's Ludovico Oscar Froissart, or Elo Froissart. Back to the text. As Lenin told Elo Froissart, quote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is exercised not only over the bourgeoisie, but also over the politically unaware or stubborn part of the proletariat and its partner, the reformers. The reformers are shot," end quote. Quote, "Proletarian legitimacy," end quote, allowed the ruling power to dispense with a true, quote, Soviet legitimacy, end quote, while claiming the latter while claiming Soviet legitimacy for itself whenever the ruling power considered it useful to claim Soviet legitimacy for itself. This Soviet legitimacy was, moreover, only an accessory. It was not a, quote, founding legitimacy, end quote, as is remarkably emphasized in the analyses of Mark Ferro. The Bolshevik Party began at the time of the October insurrection by dispossessing of power the Soviets and their Second Congress at the very moment when the Bolsheviks were supposed to have symbolically installed Soviet power. Footnote. See Marco Ferro, des Soviets. End footnote. Simultaneously, in its discourse, the Bolshevik Party made October appear as the true image of what it itself regarded as a, quote, socialist revolution, end quote. But if one analyzes the political and social consequences whose development has been encouraged by this representation of the revolution, one concludes that the October insurrection brought to power a radicalized fraction of the intelligentsia who support by part of the working class and claim to speak in the name of the proletariat. That which has entered history under the banner of socialist revolution is essentially a, quote, capitalist revolution, end quote, leading in the end to an expropriation of the direct producers. In volumes 1 and 2 of this study, I had yet to arrive at this conclusion. I believe that it was only progressively through a series of, quote, slides and, quote, ruptures that the Soviet Union got itself locked into what I called, quote, state capitalism, and that these, quote, slides and ruptures were a result, above all, of, quote, historical circumstances, and of the need to face up to difficulties which the Bolshevik Party could not have overcome in any different way. Today, I think, following the repetition of the same type of development in all those countries in which a directing party has taken Bolshevism as a guide for its action, that one must ascribe a decisive historical role to certain concepts of Bolshevism. Footnote. Here it has to be admitted that contrary to what I thought in 1974, these conceptions have had considerable historical consequences. End footnote. That is, the, quote, historical mission of the proletariat, end quote, and its party a party functioning as the imaginary source of theoretical and political truth, a socialism which, according to Lenin, is only, quote, state monopoly capitalism which is made to serve the interests of the whole people. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it's important. That is, the, quote, historical mission of the proletariat, end quote, and its party, a party functioning as the imaginary source of theoretical and political truth, a socialism which, according to Lenin, is only, quote, state monopoly capitalism which is made to serve the interests of the whole people, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. Volumes. See Lenin's Collected Works, Volume 25. End footnote. Admittedly, the molding of Bolshevik ideology is complex and contradictory, and one could quote other texts in opposition to those which assign to the revolution the goal of, quote, generalized state wage-earning class, end quote. But in the final analysis, what remains is the assimilation of socialism to state capitalism. From October 1917, such concepts helped to orientate economic and social transformation toward a, quote, capitalist revolution, end quote. However, up to 1929, this, quote, capitalist revolution, end quote, endeavored to leave a place for the peasant revolution, which seemed to promise an avenue for cooperatives. This prospect was abandoned at the end of the 1920s, when new social and political conflicts were unleashed, leading to a, quote, second revolution, end quote. The, quote, Stalinist revolution, end quote, which pushed to extremes the expansion of exploitative relationships. The concept of, quote, capitalist revolution, end quote, formulated here should be distinguished from the traditional concept of, quote, bourgeois revolution, end quote. It is used to characterize the process begun in October and relaunched and overtaken in 1929 to 30. Not simply in regard to the social forces which played a, quote, directing role, end quote, in it, but taking into account the social relationships with which this revolution consolidated and helped, in spite, or with the help, or with the help, of phrases about socialist revolution. The capitalist revolution which developed in Russia tended to eliminate the pre-capitalist forms of production, in particular small-scale commercial production. But until 1929, most of the Bolshevik leaders envisaged a progressive and, quote, peaceful elimination of these types of production. The, quote, Stalinist revolution, end quote, abandoned this prospect, relying exclusively on one part of Bolshevism's complex and contradictory concepts. It strove for the development of the most undiluted forms of capitalist production, for the most radical separation of the direct producers from their means of production, and for the destruction of the forms of consciousness and organization which would allow these producers to resist exploitation. In this way, through a complex and bruising process, the October insurrection cleared the way for two successive revolutions, one which was oriented towards a state capitalism which had a place for the peasantry, and then one which after 1929 laid the foundations, in the name of socialism and under the direction of the Bolshevik Party, of an extreme form of capitalism. Finally, this second revolution, impelled by the Stalinist leadership, imposed on the Russian people exploitative relations which enabled an exceptionally high rate of accumulation to be achieved over a certain period, at the certain cost of unprecedented oppressions. Neither the October Revolution nor the Stalinist Revolution attacked capitalist exploitation. What they did was to boost the specific political forms of domination. By means of a transformation of the juridical forms under which this capitalist exploitation operated. After October, real power was more and more exercised by the party leadership and apparat. The transformations which in course of time were impressed on the party, as much for the objective reasons as for its leadership's ideology, resulted in the party apparat becoming increasingly autonomous in relation to its membership. It tended towards self-recruitment and the purging of those who did not sufficiently submit to it. In this way, the, quote, new type, end quote, party really took shape during the 1930s. For the party leadership and the contradictions which put it in opposition to the workers, peasants or cadres, could be resolved, quote, positively only by the strengthening of its authority. In its view, the, quote, emancipation of the working class, end quote, required first of all the consolidation of its power. It considered that only highly centralized economic and political organization would permit a sufficiently high growth of production and of labor productivity. It believed, at least in 1917 and at the beginning of the 1920s, that the workers would thereby, in the end, gain the, quote, free time which they needed in order to participate actively in the management of public affairs, a consideration which disappeared during the 1930s. Thus, review of the analysis of the October Revolution and its aftermath leads to recognition of the fact that the, quote, socialist aspect of this revolution is a matter of aspirations and talk at the level of image and ideology. Nevertheless, this, quote, socialist aspect of October has had and still has considerable historical effect. The myth of the USSR as, quote, country of socialism, end quote, tends to survive in our own days, in spite of the fact that that country has a particularly radical separation and extension of a wage-earning class and a rigorous subordination of production to the limitations of capital accumulation and a surplus value. All this corresponds to an extreme form of capitalism and leads to a policy which is militaristic and expansionist. If this is far from being universally recognized, it is not only because of the strength of a foundational myth, but also thanks to complex and contradictory causes. Thus, a large number of militants, quote, desire socialism to be realized somewhere or other, and therefore invest in the USSR an imaginary socialism. Conversely, for adherents of, quote, Western capitalism and adversaries of all social change, the identification of the USSR with, quote, revolution is highly convenient because it suggests that any attempt at a radical social emancipation would inevitably lead to the dictatorship of a single party and to an arbitrary and in practice repressive regime which would preserve the privileges of an especially hidebound and arrogant minority. However, apart from the effect of the foundational myth of October, the ignorance of Soviet reality, and simple bad faith, the refusal to recognize the capitalist character of the USSR is also very often due to a simplistic and purely descriptive representation of capitalism. For those who accept such a representation, capitalist development can only take place in accordance with a, quote, normal path, end quote, which, with the model of which is England and America. The Marxist, quote, Vulgate, moreover, holds this view, even though in Lenin's view the culmination of this development was represented by Germany and the so-called, quote, directed capitalism, which that country experienced at the end of World War I. Concrete observation and historical analyses tend to produce a different view, which recognizes that there exist only specific ways of development, both of production relationships and of productive forces under capitalism, and that there is not solely an Anglo-American way of capitalist development, but also other ways which are French, Japanese, Russian, and so on. The, quote, decomposition of the, quote, old social order was especially spectacular in Russia from 1918 to 1920, and then from 1928 to 1931. Individuals until then held a dominant place in the production and reproduction process, or in the political scene, were effectively eliminated in wholesale fashion. But the transformations which resulted from this only upset the social relationships of domination and exploitation without making them disappear. This has been obscured by the elimination of the old holders of political and economic power, and by the emplacement of a strongly centralized executive power whose representatives spoke a radical language. All this gave the illusion that there had been a, quote, total break with the past, end quote, and that an entirely new social order was being built. Footnote. Volumes 1 and 2 of this study began to move away from this illusion, but were still affected by it. End footnote. The October insurrection was presented in the guise of a socialist revolution. Whereas what it did was open the way for a capitalist revolution of a specific type. October is therefore the beginning of what one might call the grand illusion of the 20th century. Footnote. These two volumes devoted to the third period, 1930 to 1941, conclude our inquiry into the class struggles in the USSR. After 1941, in effect, the foundation of the Stalinist system were firmly laid. In the USSR today, they are still in the process of deterioration. The Khrushchev period deserves to be treated as a specific phenomenon and should not be reduced to a mere episode or digression. And again, I don't know about if this means like what the significance of this is, but like the Maoist, the general like Maoist conception, like critique of like capitalism returning in the USSR, is very much political as opposed to economic, right? Like the wrong ideas came to power under Khrushchev, and may be represented in certain particular policies. But the idea was that the USSR was revisionist and state capitalist due after the death of Stalin, due to the Khrushchev period. So this thing that he says here, the Khrushchev period deserves to be treated as a specific phenomenon and should not be reduced to a mere episode or digression. I don't really know what that means here, but on the one hand, you could say it's viewing it as a specific phenomenon, and not reducing it to an episode or digression means that there's some kind of continuity in the Khrushchev era and everything that came before. So, end footnote. And that's the end of the piece. So, yeah, I originally was just going to read the the prefaces, but then I continued into that part, which is titled "Directions for Use." So that's all the like the pre. I guess that's still part of it. I guess I should title this like, the what's the word? I don't know if the preamble's the right word, but all the stuff that's in Roman numerals in terms of its page number. So thank you so much for listening. I really got a lot out of it. It kind of sparked my interest in kind of like, what is the significance of this? Like Charles Bettelheim was a huge figure, in the world of like Marxist discourse, and it was definitely very much something of an apologist for the regime at certain points, and kind of as we saw by that text. I mean, that was straight up like council communist anarchist kind of interpretation of the Soviet Union. Not even just like Menshevik, right? The Menshevik or the Menshevik social democratic. I guess Menshevik including in that, like it's even more radical. It's even it's more severe than those critics of the Soviet Union. It definitely still has like that kind of like attention to like the grassroots and the Soviets and the factory committees. Very, very fascinating piece. I've kind of focused a lot on the way people kind of like moved out of like conventional or been curious about how people moved out of Trotskyism to more libertarian interpretations of communism. But I'd like to see more how people moved out of Maoism into that direction. I know that a lot of people that kind of embrace like an anti-dogmatic Marxism in like Germany, I think, like kind of come out of certain Maoist influence like K groups, or at least I believe that to be the case, but I'm not sure. Anyway, thanks for listening.